for coming. Welcome to our Yom Hashoa program. It is so wonderful to see all of you sitting here in 3 dimensions for this year's program, along with those of you who are joining us in 2 dimensions. Thank you. Our speaker, Karmela Waldman, and her husband, Dr. Roy Waldman, have been living in the woodlands in West Orange for the past 10 years. Since COVID began, however, they have remained in Florida, which is their winter home. Karmela survived the Shoah as a young child in Yugoslavia. Her daughter Arden and her granddaughter Aiden are here with us today, and they will be introducing Karmela during the candle lighting ceremony. Karmela has joined us remotely from Florida. We are here to commemorate a catastrophic event in the history of the Jewish people, the genocide of 6 million Jews. Yom HaShoah takes place every year on the 27th day of Nisan. This is the anniversary of the ghetto uprising in Warsaw. The observance of this day was anchored in the law passed by the Israeli Knesset in 1959. My parents are both Holocaust survivors, and my mother was in Auschwitz. Every night, over the past few months, I am reminded about our history as I scour the news for the latest updates on the tragedy that is taking place right now in Ukraine. And I am wondering how many survivors and children of survivors are experiencing this horrible sense of post-traumatic stress disorder, watching the tragic murder of innocent women and children in Ukraine now. I simply cannot get these images out of my mind. In 1992, I went on the March of the Living together with my husband, Jeff, to Poland. We went as staff members together with over 2,000 yeshiva high school students. A few years ago, Dr. Saul Goldman spoke in this shul. He is a survivor who accompanied us on the March of the Living. He's also the father of Kedva Hapsher from Livingston, and his grandchildren went to Joseph Kushner Hebrew Academy. I had a particular connection to him because he came from my father's hometown, and we took one day where he just took me back to that hometown and showed me around the hometown, and he also showed me the cemetery there. I would like to share his words with you now, which he so eloquently shared in his memoirs before we sing Karmela Rachamim. This is what he said. Tonight we are here as mourners, to do what Jewish traditionalists taught us to do, to recite the modern Book of Lamentations, the Echa of our times, to remember and commemorate, to shed tears, to recite Kaddish, to seek a catharsis for our souls, and yes, as astonishing and unbelievable as this may sound, to confirm the Kedusha, the sanctity of life, and the eternal existence of our people. To do otherwise would be to render a posthumous victory to Adolf Hitler. Just as we know for thousands of years to chant at the Seder table, as we recently did, that it is man's duty to remember, as though he personally had come out of Egypt, so should we lament the tragic demise of our 6 million heroes. I would like to now call upon Josh Kaplan to sing Karmela Rachamim, which will be followed by the candle lighting ceremony.
כזוהר הרקיע מזהירי הסנישמוס הקדושים הנוהרים משום סוף שנהרגו על קדושת השם היינו הצורים הגרמנים יימח שמם בזכרם שאנו נודרים, שאנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמותיהם בגן עדן. מגן עדן די מנוחה מלאכים ברחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים בצרור החיים נשמותיהם Adonai, u'nachalasam, yanuchu v'shalom al mishkoseihem. V'nomar amen.
We will now begin the candle lighting ceremony. The first candle will be lit by Joey, Teddy, Cheryl, Hannah, and Ben Esses.
I'm lighting this candle in memory of my great-grandfather, Leon Rosen, who survived the Holocaust in hiding, and in the memory of all his family members who did not survive. Grandpa Leon moved to the United States after the war, got married, and had 4 children, 15 grandchildren, and 20 great-grandchildren so far. I am lighting this candle in memory of my grandparents, who currently survived the house and in of all of their members who did not survive. My grandpa was one of 9 children, and he survived the war by running away to Siberia. Only Moshe and his younger brother David survived. My great-grandmother Fana was in the Latci ghetto in Auschwitz and in labor camp in Germany. Like me, my great-grandma Fana was one of 5 children. She had 3 brothers and 1 sister. I also have 3 brothers and 1 sister. My sister was named Fana after my great-grandma Fana, who survived the war with her mother. Unfortunately, her father and her 4 siblings did not survive. Great-grandma Fana and Grandpa Moshe had 2 children and 5 grandchildren and 11 great-grandchildren so far.
The second candle will be lit by Ariel, Aliyah, and Dahlia Hammerman. Children, please try and speak in your loudest voices, because it's hard to hear you all across the big room.
We are lighting this candle in memory of our great grandmother Shoshana, which I am named after, who survived the Shoah in Auschwitz, and our great grandfather Abraham, who survived the Shoah by moving to Israel, and in memory of all of their family members who did not survive.
The third candle will be lit by Orly and Emma Horowitz.
We are lighting this candle in honor of our great-grandparents, David and Drew Garfinkel, who survived Auschwitz and Birkenau, and in memory of their parents, siblings, aunts, and uncles, and cousins who did not survive.
The fourth candle will be lit by Meir Kaplan.
I'm lighting this candle in honor of my Sasha Ella Cohen, who survived Auschwitz and was saved by our mother, Rachel Rose Howard. They were reunited after the war with my great-grandfather, Israel Cohen, who spent part of the war hiding in the woods. I'm also lighting in memory of a family member.
The fifth candle will be lit by Max and Molly Kurlander.
I'm lighting this candle in memory of Zadie, Mikhail, and Babilea, who survived the Shoah in Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz, and in memory of all their family members who did not survive.
The sixth and final candle will be lit by Aiden Guzman.
I'm lighting this candle in honor of my grandmother, Karmela Waldman, who survived the Shoah hiding with nuns, and in memory of her father and grandfather who were killed in Auschwitz. I'm also lighting this candle
in memory of my grandparents, Miriam and Moshe Fussman, who also survived the Holocaust in Romania. My grandmother, Karmela Waldman, was born in on August 7, 1939, in Subotica, Yugoslavia. Just 2 years later, Hungary occupied her homeland. And then on June 18, 1944, Nazis appeared at her front door and whisked away her father, Latci Krishaber. My grandmother ran through a hole in a fence in her backyard, led by her mother. The two had to separate. She was hidden in her hometown in a nunnery where she learned the Our Father prayer. She remained in hiding for 6 months. After the Russian liberation of Budapest, my grandmother was reunited with her mother, only to find out that her father and other members of her family were killed in Auschwitz. Subotica's Jewish population had shrunk from 5,000 to 1,200 post-war. My grandmother finished high school in her hometown or attending the University of Geneva, where she met her beloved husband, a medical student. The two remained married 60 years later. In 1969, she earned a master's degree in social work, practicing as a licensed therapist for close to 40 years. My grandmother is blessed with 2 children and 8 grandchildren.
Thanks, Adam. I just wanted to say that my mother inspired my daughters so much that 2 of them made Aliyah, which is Israel, and one of my daughter Hannah served in the IDF for 2 years, and it's from everything and my mother's education to them. And finally, if you want to hear my mother after this, my mother and brothers, who's a TV news reporter, Joel Waldman, started a podcast during the pandemic when there was nothing for my mother to do. My brother took her out. They started a podcast called Surviving the Survivor. They already have 50 episodes. They interviewed Greg Zuckerman and Haley Cox and a bunch of 48 other people. So if you're interested, you can listen to it afterwards. And now for my mother.
Am I supposed to speak?
While we're waiting for Larry, my daughter, who is not in the United States right now, she started a project called Hand in Hand, where she's asking for the great-grandchildren to hold the hand of a great-grandparent or grandparent who's a survivor and take a picture of it so that there's a memory for future generations.
Okay, I am here. First of all, I want to thank you for your invitation. It's a great honor for me to speak in what I consider my son-in-law's and my daughter's and my grandchildren's private synagogue. It's their synagogue. And I'm very happy to be the one who was invited, because there are still a few of us around, and I know that it's a great honor. One of the thoughts I had about speaking with you is I was very late coming to this telling about my experiences, and one of the things I did with the Kushner Yeshiva, I was invited to names or not numbers, twice for 2 different grandchildren's 7th grade what they organized in the 7th grade, so that I now got used to repeating my story, and I don't want it to become like an automatic by rote type of repetition of the same story over and over again. But I think that I am beginning to be like almost extinct species, and I'm getting more and more demands and requests to speak about the events of those days. And especially since you mentioned the Ukraine, since it happened, this horrible situation in the Ukraine, I was asked even by TV stations locally to speak and to compare my experiences during the war with the Ukrainians without making an equivalency. Would you close the door? Thank you. Without making an equivalency between the Holocaust, the Shoah, and what is going, they are non-comparable. However, there are certain points of comparison, and I would like to spend a few minutes talking about that in light of what is going on there. I was only a 5-year-old child when the Holocaust hit our area on the border between Hungary and Yugoslavia. And my experience of the war was of a kind of a little child, but a child who was very aware of many of the situations. I was only 5-year-old. The day, somebody already told the story, I think it was my granddaughter Eden mentioned that the morning they came to take us from the ghetto to the freight station to put us into the freight, the wagons, the trains, to take us to Auschwitz. My mother somehow had a presence of spirit, and she took me by the hand as if she were taking me, let's say, to a bathroom, and she walked out through the back fence and led me out of the ghetto and started to walk towards a Gentile eye doctor's place. My father was an optician who was chiseling, learned how to chisel eyeglasses. The irony is he learned this in Germany. He studied for 3 years in Germany, and we have his certificate in our house in West Orange, in our townhouse. Anyway, so this eye doctor and my father became from professional friends to friends. This was a very devout Christian, religious Catholic, the eye doctor. And when my mother knocked on his door early in the morning, with a lot of fear and trepidation that somebody would recognize us, because it was a small town with a small Jewish population, and it so happened that many people knew us or of us. My father's store was on the main street. And the doctor opened the door, let us in, went over to a nunnery that was a few blocks from his house, where he was the benefactor of these nuns. And he asked them if they would, my mother was afraid to have me with her because her plan was to go up to Budapest. I'm skipping some details, but she had false documents, but my father wouldn't let her prior to this. While we were in the ghetto, he did not allow her to take me with her to Budapest, which was only 2 hours by train, because he said he heard that the Germans were putting us into labor camps, but he knows, he lived in Germany, he knows that the Germans were a civilized, cultured, Western nation, and they would not, all the rumors that he hears are just too horrible for Germans to do, because he lived among them when he was studying. The morning that my mother took me with her, he was saying to my mother, whose name was Vera, she died in 2010, may Zikrona lebracha, he said to her, Vera, take the child, meaning myself, the 5-year-old child, take and do something, do something. That's when my mother walked out through the back fence. There was a door on the back fence of this ghetto house where we were, and she left. And then her plan was to go up to Budapest with the false documents and hide. But she was afraid that in the train or the train station, somebody would recognize her. And in her mind, she decided the best solution for me would be to stay with the nuns. And the nuns agreed. They knew I was Jewish, and they agreed. This was a life-threatening risk for these nuns, but they did it. But they said, don't bring her now, wait till the nighttime when it's dark, so nobody would see you bring her. My mother brought me there at night. I was screaming. According to everybody's story, I don't remember this myself, I was screaming that the mother who really loves her child doesn't leave her with strangers. But she left me with these nuns, and they were very nice to me. The Mother Superior was a very warm person. She assigned me one of the nuns, and I lived with the nuns for 6 months. Just like you see in the movies, they slept in like dormitories, but with the sheets between their beds so that they would have privacy. There was a smell that I remember till today. It was a smell of very clean soap, and it was cold there. Even though it was June, it was cold, and the floor was cold. And I spent the 6 months learning Christian prayers, which happened to save my life and my mother's life. And I tell you why. After 6 months in December, my mother was getting very anxious, and she heard that I was getting sickly and lost weight, and I was very pale. And she bribed a railroad worker to bring me up to Budapest, where she was hiding in a huge apartment building with 6-story high, like a block long. And literally days after I arrived, the bombardment of Budapest started. The siege of Budapest started. And I never thought about it in major detail. I just thought of our experience during this siege. But once the Ukrainian situation brought it back to me, I remembered that it was a terrible experience. The bombs were falling, the artillery was, you could hear, the snipers were there. There was famine, there was no food. And I fell into Budapest at a very wrong time. The way I saved my mother and my grandmother, which is a whole other chapter of the story, what happened to my grandmother. And it's a pretty unbelievable story, what happened to her. But anyway, we were a number of us in hiding in this apartment in Budapest. And the bombardment started, and everybody moved down to the basement. The bombardments were mostly at night. So 4 people could bring down one bed. And it was like a communal, huge basement, unfinished basement. And it was cold. It was December, beginning of January. And I was very uncomfortable with being with my family again, because I got used to being with the nuns. But I knew who I was. I knew my identity. I knew I was Jewish, and I knew I had to lie. I had to pretend that I'm Christian. And in a very loud voice, every evening before I went into this bed with 4 people sleeping in it together, I would say the Christian prayers in a very loud voice, so that the people in the basement heard me say the Christian prayers, and they stopped looking at us suspiciously, and they stopped wondering who the heck are we and what are we doing here. And now that it happened in the Ukraine, I Googled the siege of Budapest in 1945. And it's worth reading if you have time and if you're interested in light of what's going on now. It lasted 50 days. I never knew that it lasted 55 days, and buildings collapsed. Those buildings that you see in the Ukraine, that's how it looked. It almost like they are the same images. And my mother, who was sort of refined, took a big knife. In the nighttime, in the street, some of the horses, because everything was, the transportation was by tramway and by horse buggies. Even, you know, in a big city like Budapest, there were a lot of horse carriages and horses carting things. And the artillery shells killed these horses. They were lying in the snow. I remember the snow wasn't even clean. It was like a gray snow. And people were coming with big knives and cutting out pieces of these horses for food, to eat, to have something to eat. And that was one of the things that my mother did. You know, she has a brother who is a rabbi, and she was a very religious person, and she did this. Then came the time when the Russians encircled Budapest, and the Nazi Hungarians and the Nazi Germans, I just learned the details from Google, were inside the city. And the Russians were already fighting the Nazis for 5 years when they got there, when they got to Budapest, to the siege. They didn't get any furloughs or, you know, tour of duty and you can go home and refresh yourself. They were fighting straight and steady all this time on the side of the Allies during World War II. And the irony of life is that they were our liberators. And I have a vivid memory of the night that they came to our basement. They broke into our basement, and we were all huddling there, scared. And my mother, who had a presence of spirit, she walked over to one of the Russians and spoke with him in Serbo-Croatian. And you would wonder, why did she speak to him in Serbo-Croatian? The reason is that Serbo-Croatian, where one of the languages in the town where I grew up is Serbo-Croatian. And my mother knew Serbo-Croatian because it was part of Yugoslavia until the Hungarian Nazis ran it over. So my mother walked over to him and spoke to him in Serbo-Croatian and said to him, we are refugees here. We don't belong here. Please help us. And a lot of miracles happened to my family during all the time, not during the war only. My 5 beautiful granddaughters in West Orange are also miracles. But that night, one of the officers was Jewish, one of the officers who came in. Now, double checked on Google, this particular unit of the Red Army that liberated us were Ukrainian units. So it's like a full, I was like, I couldn't believe it until I read it with my own eyes. I always thought they were the Red Soviets, the Soviet Army, the Soviet Union. I never distinguished were they from Moscow or were they from Kiev or wherever they were from. But turns out they were these units, these Ukrainian units, and they were our liberators. Now, I cannot say that they were, quiet children or perfect saints. They were very, very angry at the Hungarians, and some of them they brought in the other room and shot, killed them, the ones who were hiding in the basement. We heard women screaming in another part of the basement, and we assumed that they were raped. But with us, they were for a number of reasons. A, the officer was Jewish. B, my mother spoke with him in a Slavic language. Till now, I always thought that the Slavs kind of stuck together. And now I see that the Russians are fighting the Ukrainians, both Slavic people. So I'm a little confused there. Anyway, after we were liberated, because we considered ourselves liberated, these were all the allies. It's just that it was the Russian part of the Allied forces that liberated us. Since there was famine in Budapest, we decided to go back to our hometown, Subotica. And Subotica is 2 hours by train from Budapest. It took us 2 weeks to get back home. There was snow on the road. There were no trains. There were no, the trucks would take you 20 miles and they would stop, and then you would have to sleep somewhere, and it was a horrible, some of the road I know we walked. We had no way of transportation. It was a big, but we wanted very badly to get back home. We stayed with some peasants who, according to my mother, were nice to us, but at night they stole our things. And anyway, then in the end, we got back to our hometown. Since we were in the ghetto before we left, our house was almost like an exchange between a family. The ghetto in Subotica was in a part of town that was called the Garden Town. Little tiny houses surrounded by gardens. And our house was in the center of town. That was the place where the Jews lived, in the center of town. And when we had to go to the ghetto, we negotiated with this, my father and mother negotiated with these people to exchange houses. When we got back, they immediately opened up our house for us. We went back to our house. Everything was there. Even photographs were there. What happened to my grandfather, is the very sad part of these events. My father and grandfather were separated from the woman's side. They went on the freight train. They arrived to Auschwitz. When they arrived to Auschwitz, my father, who was only 34-year-old, went over. We have witnesses to this with other people from the town, and in perfect German said to the man, if you need my expertise, I learned in Germany how to chisel eyeglasses. And immediately the soldier put him in the line for the gas chamber, immediately. And then my grandfather, who was early 50s, was standing there. This was his son-in-law. And when he saw that they didn't know which was for the gas chamber, which was not, he stepped over to next to my father to join him to go into the gas chamber. And that's how my father and grandfather were killed. If I don't know if people have questions, if I should I cannot hear you. Help. Ilyana, are you here? Now I can hear her, but I couldn't hear her before.
Anybody have any questions?
I was just wondering how you know what happened to your father and grandfather. Were there statements told you afterwards?
Say the question again. I was playing with it. What was it?
I was wondering
I
how
don't
you know.
hear.
Oh, okay. You tell me now. Oh, how did you know about your grandfather and father? Who were the witnesses? How did you find out about that?
Oh, all the people, all the Jews from my town knew each other. They were standing in line. They were standing in line when they were sorting out people, right? As you got off the trains in Auschwitz, they were standing there and they heard the conversation and they reported it back to my mother and my grandmother.
Any other questions? Can you tell the story about how your grandmother survived?
The way my grandmother survived is even more miraculous than miraculous. My mother's mother and my mother's father, so my grandparents and my parents, and I was an only child, we were the five of us in this place in the ghetto. And when my mother walked out the back fence, in the door on the back fence, my grandmother encouraged her, but she couldn't go with her because it would have been too obvious to the people who were collecting us that suddenly everybody's disappeared. And so my grandmother went to the train station. Everybody was told the night before to pack a suitcase. She had a little hard, those old-fashioned suitcases that you can sit on it. They're made of leather, hard little suitcases. And she went to the train station and she was now alone, the only woman. They separated the men from our family. But she knew people there. So she sat down on her own suitcase and she was sitting next to a woman that she knew only not as a friend, but like just by sight. Suddenly, the siren went off. Nobody knows why the siren went off, but it went off. And in the moment when the siren went off, my grandmother said to the woman who was sitting next to her, whose name I have and who is a witness to this, and he's out of the blue, my grandmother said to this woman, "Let's run." The two of them stood up. There were 5,000 Jews in this town. That's the number that was sitting there, or close to that number. And the two of them jumped up and started to run away. They ran into a peasant house. The freight station is a little out of town, and there are a lot of like houses where you can literally drive a horse buggy into the yard. You have to have been in Eastern Europe to know what I'm talking about here. So they ran into the yard, and a peasant woman was standing right at the door watching the Jews being taken away. Okay, and two soldiers started to run after them. And they said to the peasant woman as they were running, did you see two women run away? And the peasant woman pointed in opposite direction. She didn't say they are hiding in the yard. She said they went that way. And saved my grandmother's life. And the minute the soldiers started to run that way, my grandmother and the woman came out and they walked away. And my grandmother knew that my mother went to the eye doctor's house, Dr. Scherzer's house. And she went right to Dr. Scherzer's house, and this gave my mother the strength and the courage to get through the next 8-9 months, because they were very close and my grandmother was a very strong person too. So that's how my grandmother survived, and she was my favorite person.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Yes, I'll say it and I'll repeat it. Karmela, as an adult, did you ever go back to your hometown?
Yes, I do. That's another, yes, I do. I finished high school in Yugoslavia. I went to, there is an irony here, I have to mention it. My high school was called, in Subotica was called the Moshe Pijade High School. I went to Serbo-Croatian schools. The reason we never left there when we could have was that my mother, my father was killed, and my mother married a man whose wife, pregnant wife and son were gassed in Auschwitz. So my mother married my stepfather Latci, and they were trying to have a baby, and they had a baby in 1948, who is my sister. And they were afraid, they were already all said they had a container to move to Israel. But because of the war in Israel and my mother's pregnancy, they stayed in Subotica. And then my stepfather was kind of a broken man. He was an engineer by profession, also studied in Germany, irony of life, before World War II. It was customary, if you could afford to study there. And he ended up working as an electro engineer in the local factory, and that was our life. We were living in this, continued to live in this small town. And I like to tell this story if anybody wants to listen to it. It's kind of the town where I was born and went until the end of high school was like a multi-ethnic town. There were Serbs, there were Hungarians, there were Croats, there were Bunjevacs, and we all, every year for some reason, they did statistics in the beginning of the year. How many Serbs? The Serbs raised their hand. How many Croats? The Croats raised their hands. How many Bunjevacs? Finally, they say, how many other? And I was always the only other. Through the 12 years I went to school there. But my classmates were very, we got along, we were friends, we were good. You know, it was a life with I was the other, and they were very accepting of the other. And I even went back for my 50th high school reunion, which was in 2008.
Hi, can you hear me?
Now, yes, but before,
Okay.
no.
Okay, I have a question. How many other people from the Jewish community survived the war, and how many came back to your hometown besides your family?
Okay, there is an irony here, a major irony. When we were taken away, the town where I was born and where I lived until I was 18, almost 19, was liberated 3 months later. In other words, we were like the last ones with the horrible experience. Okay, now I have a senior moment. Can you ask the question again? Oh yeah, I remember now. I remember how. Ask the numbers, right? The numbers. There were 5,000 Jews in this town before World War II, 5,000. And because it was so close to the end, miraculously, and it's a horrible, horrible number, but they weren't all wiped away, 1,200 survived. 1,200 out of the 5,000. Nothing to brag about. But that's how many survived, 1,200.
Thank you. My memory of reading about survival rates from different countries, I think, is that something like 95% of Polish Jewry did not survive.
I know. I have. If you have time,
Typically,
if you have time, I will tell you something.
Wait a minute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, what I was saying is I think I had read that about 95% of Polish Jewry did not survive. So by comparison, there was a much higher survival rate from.
Yeah, because the Hungarian,
Wait a minute.
it happened in the very end. It happened in the very end. They have major problems.
Does anyone have any other questions? And if not, I will call up.
My husband has one more question. He wants to tell a story about the white coat.
Your son-in-law wants you to tell the story about the white coat.
Oh, when my mother was so nervous. Is this the white coat that you're referring to, or the white coat you wear? Anyway, my mother was so nervous when we were ready to leave that of all the clothes that she had, she put on a white coat to run away. And at that time, everybody was wearing, it was towards the end of the war already, everybody was wearing gray and black and brown. And she had blonde hair, and she was a pretty woman, and she stuck out tremendously. People knew her. And I don't know if this is what my son-in-law is referring to, but Ben is referring to, but my mother had this terrible coat that was almost screaming, "Pay attention to me, pay attention to me." So they gave her a dark coat instead of the light one when she was going to the train station late at night after they dropped me off with the nuns, and she traveled in a dark coat. But this is the story of the coat. We can't hear it.
I would like to call upon Moshe Roth to sing Ani Manu. Thank you.
Witness, play second machine. Yeah, she's
They had
Thank
major.
you, Karmela, for your testimony, for your strength, and for serving as an inspiration to us. Yom HaShoah was declared by law by the Israeli government in 1959. And the reason for this specific day is because on this day, that's when the Warsaw Ghetto began. The tune that became the anthem for the Jews in the Shoah was composed by Azriel David Fastag on the train going to Treblinka. He composed it and he started singing this to himself. And then ultimately he sang it in a louder voice. And then everyone on the train joined him and sang the song. He said that he would give half his sachar to anyone who brought this song to his Rebbe. Two guys managed to jump off the train. One was killed. And one brought it to his Rebbe, the Majesta Rebbe in New York. Let's take a moment to understand the words that we're going to say in the song. It's taken from the Rambam's 13 Principles of Judaism, and it's printed in the back of the Siddur right after Shacharis. And the 13 principles, the parallel the 13 attributes of Hashem. So this version of the song begins by repeating the words, Ani Ma'amin, I believe. Repeats it 3 times. When we do something 3 times, we call it a chazaka. Chazaka comes from the word chazak, meaning strong. When we do something 3 times, it becomes ingrained. Much as we say in Kedusha, Kadosh, 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 or repeat at the end of Yom Kippur, we say, Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto L'Olam Va'ed. We say that 3 times. And then even in English, when we testify in a courtroom, we say, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Ani Ma'amin, I believe. Be'emunah Shlema, with a full belief. Ma'amin and emunah stem from the word amen. And the word amen is an acronym of the words El Melech Ne'eman. El means strength, the strong one. Melech means king. Ne'eman, in whom we have full belief and trust and confidence. V'viyat HaMashiach, in the coming of the Messiah. The Afal Pishit Mameya, and even though he tarries and delays and makes us wait, Im Kozeh Ani Ma'amin, despite this, I continue to believe. 2 years ago, just before COVID hit, my sister, my nephew, and I accompanied my mother back to Auschwitz to attend the 75th commemoration of Auschwitz liberation by the Russians on January 27th. She had been in Auschwitz when she was a young girl. We stood in front of the entrance to the gas chambers that the Germans tried to blow up in order to conceal and obliterate it. It's nearly impossible for any of us to imagine walking into a gas chamber or walking in toward a pit to be shot. But it's not too distant the memory when the Twin Towers came down, where 26 people lost their lives at Sandy Hook Elementary in Connecticut, or when those who were praying in a synagogue in Pittsburgh or Poway were killed. Imagine, just imagine, if we were rounded up in this shul and it was then set on fire, as the Nazis had done many, many times in many communities. When we sing this song with this tune, we affirm that although we can't imagine the fear and the horror that those that were on those trains felt as they were going to their certain death. We honor their lives. They didn't die in vain. We're here to grieve and remember them. We survived and rebuilt. And we too believe with full faith and await Mashiach to arrive. Please stand and join me. Ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, be'emuna sheleina, be'viyat HaMashiach, be'viyat HaMashiach, ani ma'amin. ואף על פי שהתמהמה, עם כל זה אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, באמונה שלמה. בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח אני מאמין.
Thank you, Moshe, for speaking and for singing. Last year, remotely, we had a program and Moshe's mom was the keynote speaker, and she just celebrated her 98th birthday. Yeah. And thank you all for coming, and the program is now concluded.